I don't know where it all started. We're very peaceful, friendly. They call us criminals, they call us terrorists. I don't understand how. Why would they say that?
Grace Worrell still remembers the horror of pre-dawn raids by the RCMP.
We had a cupboard in the kitchen. It was like a flour bin, but in the back we could crawl in and sort of hide because we were quite small yet.
It was not a pleasant job to go and have to take a child away from their parents. It was our job, our duty to do it, and we had no choice but to do it. But it wasn't a pleasant task.
Mom was shaking us, waking us up, and saying that you have to get dressed because the police are here to take you away. Mom and Dad kissed us goodbye, and we got in and left.
These Canadian children, offspring of a small and sometimes extreme group of Doukhobors known as the Sons of Freedom, were held as virtual prisoners during the 1950s. For some of these children, their sorrow would find expression in a deep and bitter rage. A few would turn to arson and worse, in the most sustained terrorist campaign this country has ever known. The Doukhobors are religious dissenters known today as pacifists and vegetarians. Most of them have a history of living communally. Others have rejected public education of their children. To understand why they have clashed with Canadian governments, we must take ourselves back to Mother Russia over 2 centuries ago.
The Doukhobors originated as kind of a rebel movement against the Orthodox Church in Russia. One of the commandments had to do with not having graven images before me, and yet they would go to church and see people kissing and lighting candles in front of icons. They said, no, the Spirit of God can't exist in a piece of painted wood. The Spirit of God must exist in the presence and the hearts of other people.
The church labels them Doukhobors, people who fight against the Holy Ghost. Yes, reply the Doukhobors, we are spirit wrestlers. We follow the spirit of Christianity, not the written word.
The Book of Life was the sum total of all of their hymns, psalms, sayings, Pabaski in Russian, and they said basically write it in the heart, but do not write it in a script. If it's in your heart and you know it and believe it, it lives. If it's written down, it dies.
In 1887, most Doukhobors choose Peter the Lordly Verrigan as their new leader. But in one of the many splits that will divide the community, some Doukhobors reject this aristocratic figure and convince government officials that Verrigan represents a menace to the Russian state. As a result, he is banished to Siberia. As leader, Verrigan is perceived as semi-divine, and his letters home nothing less than holy decrees. One of these dispatches launches the Doukhobor tradition of pacifism and vegetarianism. Verrigan is becoming inspired by the ideas of Count Leo Tolstoy, the celebrated novelist. Each person bears the spark of God, says Tolstoy. To kill a human is to kill God. Killing animals is also immoral, as is using alcohol and tobacco.
My own father was an independent Doukhobor. At the same time, in Russia, at the time of Peter Lordly Verrigan's leadership, he had said, had we not followed, had we not had this feeling towards Peter Verrigan, that he was sort of like a Christ among us, he says we would not have been able to go as a whole group and go through all the suffering that we did.
In 1895, urged on by Verrigan, Doukhobors gather up their firearms and burn them. The new Tsar, Nicholas II, sets his cavalry, the dreaded Cossacks, upon these protesters, driving 4,000 from their homes. Fearing for the Doukhobors' survival, Tolstoy issues an international call for a country to take them in. Canada hears his plea and hastily works out the terms of their immigration. In 1899, 7,500 Doukhobors sailed to Canada. Finally, they believe, they are free of conflict with governments. In the new land, they will surely thrive by following their credo, toil and peaceful life.
What was clear was that they were to be exempt from military service, and they were given blocks of land which were reserved for their sole use. But with respect to how they were to obtain title to that land, things were not very clear, and it was left there, open to interpretation, unfortunately, by both sides, both the Doukhobors and the government.
Canada is on the verge of an economic boom. Doukhobor settlers are a godsend. The federal government responds generously, granting them 350,000 prime prairie acres in Saskatchewan. The pioneering feminist, Emily Murphy, is a neighboring farmer. She is most impressed with the Doukhobors, especially the women.
By unfriendly critics, much has been made of the fact that the Doukhobor women perform the arduous work of harnessing themselves to the plough, where this is entirely at their own suggestion. These women are housewives who do not believe that their homes are jails, and they are not expected, as our women are, to be a combination of Mary, Martha, and the Queen of Sheba. Their bodies are not jails of bones and steels, and they wear no cotton batting contrivances.
The Doukhobor villages were really exotic in the Western Canadian context. They were a little bit like the Mennonite villages in that they were Strassendorf villages or street villages. Basically what you had was a central street with the farmsteads lined up on either side facing each other across this central street.
Once in Canada, some abandoned their communal life, becoming so-called independent Doukhobors. To them, a spiritual life does not depend on living communally. Uncertainty about how to live as Doukhobors in this new land is made worse by cryptic letters from their leader in Siberia. Verrigan writes about the need to go and preach the truth. Some decide this is a call to action. They free their animals and burn all objects made from brother ox and sister cow, harnesses, shoes, and belts. They set out on a trek, tramping from village to village to convert their fellow Doukhobors.
The 1902 trek was a real phenomenon. It brought out 1,700 Doukhobors. It was prompted by several factors. One, the government of the day was putting pressure on them to take out land individually, and they felt that they were betrayed. Two, they wanted to see Peter V. Verrigan. He was still in exile. Three, they looked for a warmer climate, because it was pretty cold in Saskatchewan.
Most Doukhobors joined the public in ridiculing these zealots. A reporter from the Manitoba Free Press sees them as being on the verge of madness.
Every man's face is an index, silent and eloquent, of what he has seen and is enduring. The glare of sunken eyes give evidence that minds are weakening under the combined influence of religious dementia, starvation, and exhaustion. A drizzling rain is falling to add to the self-inflicted miseries of these martyrs to mistaken ideals of right.
Fearing disaster and freezing temperatures, the Northwest Mounted Police persuade the women and children to turn back. 2 weeks later, they force the starving men onto a train bound for their own villages. A month later, Peter the Lordly Verrigan is freed from Siberia.
Peter Verrigan came to Canada in 1902 and found the Doukhobors in a very confused state. They were antagonistic to registering for the individual pieces of land, which was causing problems with the government. And so consequently, Not only the Doukhobors were very glad to see Peter Verrigan, but the Canadian government was very glad to see him as well. Peter Verrigan solved the immediate problem of land registration. He came to the conclusion that signing for individual pieces of land was merely a formality. Basically, what was essential to Doukhoborism was the communal way of life. And so consequently, he and two others signed for the Doukhobor community, some 2,300 and some homesteads.
Some Doukhobors grow concerned as their belief in a simple communal life is challenged in a land where private ownership is supreme. Tension builds until the spring of 1903, when a radical element sets out on another trek, and this time take off their clothes as a form of protest. Alex Mohortov described this pilgrimage in biblical terms.
We went in the manner of the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, to show humanity how man should return to his fatherland and return the ripened fruits of its seeds.
They felt that the Orthodox Doukhobors were becoming too materialistic, and so they were hoping at that time, I suppose, to kind of bring the main body of the Doukhobors back to what they thought was their very simple concept of toil and peaceful life.
3 kilometers from the town of Yorkton, Saskatchewan, the police order them to return home, but they press on until a posse of townsfolk intercept the pilgrims and forcibly dress them. The marchers are herded into Yorkton, tried for indecent exposure, and sentenced to 3 months in jail.
When the Doukhobors came in 1899, there wasn't a whole lot of pressure on the land yet. There were lots of people coming into the West, and so consequently, people were anxious, were land hungry.
In 1907, the government reneges on its agreement to allow the Doukhobors to farm communally. It decrees that each family must farm its own 160-acre block. But individual ownership of land is contrary to God's law, the Doukhobors insist. The plea falls on deaf ears. The government expropriates 260,000 acres of their land. Except for a minority of independent Doukhobors, the Russian immigrants lose all but the plots of prairie turf that they have broken. In the Doukhobor memory, this land seizure remains a deep wound. Looking to resettle his people, Verrigan visits southeast British Columbia and is impressed. The land resembles the Doukhobors' homeland near the Black Sea. Verrigan buys 5,000 acres and relocates most of his Saskatchewan flock. His community Doukhobors plant orchards, build sawmills, a brick-making plant, and a jam factory. By the 1920s, 90 communal villages have taken root in British Columbia's Kootenay district. Verrigan's Christian community of universal brotherhood finds some contemporary trappings indispensable.
It was the first business organization in the Canadian prairies to have its own telephone lines, to have a significant number of typewriters, to buy as a block a number of steam tractors, traction engines, for working its fields.
Verrigan sees this new beginning as his opportunity to build a real utopia, people living together, sharing work, food, and possessions. But non-Doukhobor businessmen are concerned about a self-sufficient commune that threatens to monopolize the land and destroy their markets.
It was feared, for example, that it would displace the Anglo-Canadian economy of the West Kootenays. The Doukhobor commune did buy some of its very large bulk goods outside the region, but it also bought significantly within the region.
Self-sufficiency is one complaint about the Doukhobors. Refusing to register births and deaths is another. But their resistance to the public education of their children ignites the strongest passions of all.
There was a real objection to the large proportion of the curriculum which ran contrary to Doukhobor ideals. History was the history of kings and battles. Mathematics was the mathematics of calculating interest, calculating profit and loss. And these seem to be strongly lacking in the spiritual ideals that Doukhobors wanted to inculcate.
Spiritual ideals versus education. It's an old conflict. But the conflict that is about to explode in British Columbia over the next half-century will make headlines around the world. The Russian Revolution of 1917 adds to Canadian distrust of Doukhobors. Now anything Russian or faintly communistic causes alarm. In 1919, the federal government bans the immigration of anyone regarded as undesirable because of their peculiar habits, modes of living, methods of holding property, and who are not likely to become readily assimilated. Conflict with the outside community is not the only source of problems. Ongoing internal strife over education and materialism incite the zealots to set the torch, not only to their own communal schools, but to the opulent home of Verrigan himself. Despite these differences, Verrigan's charisma and competence hold together a vibrant community. The Christian community of Universal Brotherhood owns 72,000 acres of land from Saskatchewan to British Columbia, and their mills and grain elevators are thriving. But tragedy strikes in October of 1924, when an explosion rips apart the Canadian Pacific rail car in which the Doukhobor leader is riding. Peter the Lordly Verrigan and 8 other people die instantly. 7,000 people assembled for Verrigan's funeral. They march singing mournfully to a gravesite on a mountaintop, overlooking the confluence of the Columbia and Kootenay rivers.
For the community Doukhobors, the person they trusted, the person they saw as an image of Christ here and now on the earth, had been taken away, and been taken away in a particularly bloody and brutal fashion. It was just a further example of how hard it was to be a Doukhobor, even in a country like Canada, which pretended to be a very enlightened country.
6 weeks after Verrigan's funeral, Doukhobors gather at the gravesite to choose a successor. The favorite is Verrigan's son, Peter P. Verrigan. But this Verrigan II, Chistako, as he would be known, is still in the Soviet Union. Halfway around the world or not, Chistako is not above suspicion in his father's death.
My personal conclusion was that there was a power struggle between his son and him. There was huge amounts of monies to be distributed. The old Peter Verrigan was getting older, and the young fellow was Chestikov, was very eager to seize power. So I would say judgment might prove that Peter, the Chestikov, was in conspiracy to do it.
Most Doukhobors see a conspiracy all right, but they're convinced that the plot was cooked up by the RCMP and the Canadian government.
During the time as I was growing up, in my younger years, we always had this, in our family, there was discussions about Peter the Lordly's death. Everybody in the community felt that the government was behind the killing of Peter the Lordly.
No evidence has ever surfaced to determine responsibility for Peter the Lordly's death. The Doukhobors work optimistically while pushing for the release of Peter P. Verrigan from the Soviet Union. And in 1927, the much-anticipated leader arrives in Canada. At first sight, the new Verrigan is impressive. Like his father, he is physically imposing, dapper, and magnetic. But to the dismay of his people, he smokes and drinks to excess. To those who question his habits, Verrigan replies simply, "Do as I say, not as I do."
he made a major talk by beginning, I, Chistiko, the cleanser, am here to part the light from darkness. I'm here to cleanse the Doukhobor organism from its cancerous growth. And people begin to call him after this Chistiko. Certainly the followers would call him Chistiko because he's the cleanser.
Chistiko directs his words to those Doukhobors who most fiercely resist public schooling. Standing there in the nude, they hear him praise their key role among the Doukhobors. Sons of freedom, he declares, cannot be slaves of corruption.
He gave the Freedomites the title of bell ringers, the avant-garde group. It was a kind of a license to keep people on the true and narrow path of equality and nonviolence. And in fact, to this day, these people consider themselves as the true spirit wrestlers.
He makes it so that villages can run more independently and more efficiently, and that works well. On the other side, he drinks to excess frequently. He gambles compulsively and not at all skillfully. On top of that, it's community money, not personal money, that he gambles with. And there are accounts of him going to gambling parties in Trail and being able to lose $10,000 or $12,000 a night and do the same thing a week or so later.
Well, when Chistikov, on the one hand, said to the Sons of Freedom, you are the conscience of the Doukhobors, and on the other hand was saying to the state, the government of British Columbia, we will send our children to school, that provided a problem for the Sons of Freedom. And so there develops among the Sons of Freedom, some Sons of Freedom at least, the notion that when the leader says one thing, particularly in his relations with the state, he means the opposite, right? So if he says, we will send our children to school, we will comply with the truancy rules, he means exactly the opposite. Don't send your children to school.
In dire need of money, Verrigan orders everyone living on lands owned by the community to pay dues. Those who don't are evicted. In the summer of 1929, hundreds of homeless Freedomites descend on Nelson, British Columbia. Ordered to disperse, the Freedomites dramatically reply to both Chistiko and the government. They strip. You have taken everything but our clothes, is the message. Take these too.
They recognize that this is something that brings things clearly to a halt. The nudity is political, and it is very pointed and very clear about its political agenda, and it is not a sexual event. So it's crafty, it's innocent, it's utopian, but it is also hostile and aggressive. It is a combination.
Nudity in the Doukhobor religion, I feel like it is just to be naked in front of God the way you were made, in your natural form. You don't have anything to hide, and you're open in the way that God made you to just pray and give yourself up to whatever you're standing up for.
If the Freedomites' purpose is to arouse indignation, they succeed spectacularly. A memo penned by the BC Deputy Attorney General expresses the public reaction.
If they staged in the United States the processions that they have attempted here, the civil population would feel so outraged that they would have shot them on sight.
A change was made in the criminal code in 1930 to the effect that the penalty for public nudity would now be 3 years maximum. It had been 6 months. And the idea was that if the Sons of Freedom chose to parade in the nude, then they would be arrested, they would be charged, and they would be convicted of this offense, and they could be put into jail.
In 1932, police seized the chance to try out the new law near Nelson. When Freedomites gather, police arrest 117 of them, naked or not. Outraged at this perceived abuse of power, Orthodox Doukhobors joined Freedomites in a nude protest. Sunday after Sunday, The arrests continue. The officer in charge describes his dilemma.
Yesterday, when we picked up 254 Doukhobors, the other Doukhobors seemed to be stripping just as fast as we could pick them up. This seems to give them the impression that they are managing to overcrowd our jails, and they state that they will come in such numbers that our jails will not hold them.
Unable to dissuade the protesters, the provincial police resort to cow itch powder. The roundup corrals 745 men, women, and children behind barbed wire at Nelson.
Now, as the penalties were over 2 years, it became a federal responsibility as to where they went. There was no jail or penitentiary that could accommodate 600 plus people. And so a penal colony was established on Piers Island, which is at the top end of the Saanich Peninsula. And there, these adult Sons of Freedom were put to serve their 3-year penalties. While they were there, their children were transported from southeastern British Columbia to the lower mainland, to the Victoria area, and they were put into fosterage, into orphanages, into industrial schools.
357 children, aged 2 months to 17 years, are seized. The Deputy Attorney General makes no effort to conceal the government's attempt at forced assimilation.
The policy is to scatter the children as much as possible in environments where they will get a proper conception of what living conditions should be in a Christian country.
The government's idea of a Christian environment is an institution for delinquents. 12-year-old Mikit Nazarov speaks barely any English when he is ushered into the provincial boys' industrial school.
The military was very strong at that point, and they had bands play God Save Our King and go past the picture frame of the King George V, and we had to salute like anybody else, and we didn't salute. And that's where the beating came up.
The superintendent is so despised by his own staff that a provincial public inquiry is later held into his conduct. One staffer testifies that David Branken is a bully and a tyrant. Doukhobor poet Tim Samarodin recalls the beating he got from Branken.
He just rushed up to me, grabbed the back of my chair, yanked at it, and it came apart in his hand. And she just picked out one of the struts there and started beating me with that. I guess I must have been bleeding some. There was all the rest of the boys were crying. Some were screaming. And they chose 8, 9 of us out of the whole group. And they separated us and they took us to the playground. They made us stand in a row several feet apart out in the sun. And one or two of the boys passed out. I know I felt sick, and I threw up my dinner or breakfast or whatever it was.
Yeah, the government's early 1930 strategy on re-education was not only a dismal failure because it failed to turn the minds of the children, it in fact embittered the minds of the children and their parents. And when both groups returned to southeastern British Columbia in 1934 and 1935, what happens is that the truancy problem is still there. And secondly, there is a new outburst of school burnings.
Weakened by ongoing Freedomite violence, by Chistico's extravagant spending, and a decade of economic depression, the Christian community of Universal Brotherhood is broke. The mortgage holders foreclose.
The land and improvements were worth some $6 million. The mortgages on them were for approximately $1 million, just a little over. By the time the commune had settled up as far as it could, it had paid off all but approximately $350,000 of the balance owing. They could not make that last $350,000. As soon as the foreclosure was legitimated by the courts, the province passed the Doukhobor Lands Acquisition Act. It paid somewhere around $260,000 to acquire the mortgages, and thus it acquired $6 million worth of land and improvements.
The government said, you may stay in your villages, but we will take all of your assets to make sure that we are paid. What did this do? This created a situation for the Doukhobors where they had no economic base and no economic resource.
With the stroke of a pen, the largest experiment in communal living in North American history is terminated. For the second time since arriving in Canada, the Doukhobors are stripped of their land. In 1939, the Doukhobor community is in financial ruin. His body racked by self-abuse, the leader, Peter Chistako-Verrigan, dies. Continuing the family dynasty, Chistako's son, Peter Verrigan III, is recognized as the new leader. But Yestrobo, as the next leader is called, is in a Soviet prison. In his absence, Chistako's 17-year-old grandson, John J. Verrigan, is installed as interim leader.
Leadership is the pole that holds up the tent roof of the religion. And without leadership and without a specific figure, it seems that the sect cannot function and cannot flourish. So the maintenance of the religion is dependent in many ways on having a divine leader.
Divinity seems to be absent from John J. Verrigan, and Freedomites spurn him. Without a commonly accepted leader, the Doukhobors are swept up in a world war in which their exemption from military duty is challenged. The federal government orders all men and women over age 16 to register. Many Doukhobors refuse, and in 1943, the Zealots underline their position. In a single night, they burned 6 of the most prominent buildings of their old commune, now owned by the state. The wartime economic boom offers many Doukhobors the opportunity to accumulate wealth. The Freedomites see this as a sure sign that their Orthodox brethren have become slaves of corruption, and they wage a war of their own to prevent it. The pacifism so dear to the Orthodox Doukhobors begins to break down. They hire school guards, stand night watch in their own homes with rifles, and occasionally retaliate with violence of their own.
The Sons of Freedom used arson quite liberally. Is there something specifically Doukhobor about this? And as usual, there's 2 answers. First of all, there is an old Russian peasant tradition of resistance against the Cossacks. It was used against the Napoleonic army, of scorched earth. You retreat into a safe place and you burn your crops, you burn your house, so that the invader will find no relief. It's also a powerful spiritual tool. And if you have a politically inclined leader, it's not that hard to manipulate a spiritually minded person and to tell them, you should burn this down. This will make things better for the Doukhobors, and if you don't do it, you're not a good Doukhobor.
Into this chaos appears just such a politically inclined leadership contender, a dark, charismatic preacher who has recently escaped from the Soviet Union. His name is Stefan Sorokin, but some Freedomites swear this is Yestrobo in disguise.
And then when he did appear, I just remember my uncle, my dad, how they discussed about whether it's him or not. And my dad said, yeah, guys, that's him. Peter III, Yestrobo.
Unknown to the Doukhobors, Chistako's son, Yestrobo, had died in a Soviet prison years earlier. But the Freedomites, desperate for a spiritual leader, are easily deceived.
He came in as a stranger. He's not a Doukhobor at all. He came in like White Knight or Jesus emerging out of the clouds, you know. and he somehow convinced that group that he's their leader.
I think you have to look at the fact that he infiltrated a group of people that really wasn't very literate. You know, I mean, the Sons of Freedom were peasants and farmers, and for the longest time, and faithful people. For somebody to come in with excellent oral skills, excellent diplomatic skills, it's easy to win over and charm people over that way.
By 1950, Cold War paranoia is driving a global arms race. The Sons of Freedom demonstrate against this military escalation by burning their homes and taking off their clothes.
When they burn in protest of a war or something, well, I'd just burn my house, I'd sacrifice it to illustrate to a person, like what you'd have to lose. And I'd sooner lose my own than take somebody else's soul.
You'd rather see your home burned?
I'd burn it myself than go and kill somebody and burn their house.
For no reason apparent to outsiders, the violence escalates, clearly aimed at wreaking havoc beyond the Doukhobor community. Freedomite blasts bring down bridges, fell power poles, and mangle railway track.
We received information, which was by way of an anonymous phone call, that the railroad tracks between Blueberry and Kinnaird were going to be blown up. To see if we could catch them in the act of doing it, two of us went down to Blueberry, got onto the tracks, and walked towards Kinnaird. We had walked about a mile when about 200 yards in front of us, the tracks were blown up. Debris flew very close to us, but we weren't injured at all. And it was right on the corner where if a train had come along with that track blown out, the train would have gone down over the embankment about 200 to 300 feet.
By 1950, hundreds of Freedomites are in jail. For 2 years, the government tries a new angle to study and understand the Doukhobor issue. But this moderate approach is swept away by a larger experiment underway in British Columbia. A new government calling itself Social Credit.
It was a law and order government, and it had what seemed to many people a responsible, if right-wing, agenda for the future of the province.
Premier W.A.C. Bennett promises radical action to solve the province's outstanding problems. High on the agenda is the Doukhobor issue. In early 1953, the new Attorney General, Robert Bonner, argues that drastic action is needed.
I think some of the difficulty currently being experienced arises out of a vacillating policy toward the Sons of Freedom and the Doukhobor community generally since they came to Canada over 50 years ago. We simply adopted the policy of enforcing the existing law that everyone else supports.
The RCMP applauds a get-tough policy and suggests that a new jail be built to imprison the Doukhobors en masse. But the government's first move is on the issue of education.
The educational plan of the Socred government, I think, went like this. We need to give the parents the chance to send their children to school. If they do not do so, then the state can step in and through the use of child welfare legislation, take the children and give them the education which they need and they deserve.
When the situation in Victoria changed with the incoming of a Socred government under Premier Bennett, I received a call from him expressing his pleasure in my being there on the spot in the situation. And he said, well, surely you'll be a great help to us because you know the people and you know probably the names of the children. And so at that point, I told Mr. Bennett I would have no part whatsoever in this obscene political action, and told him I was resigning my position at that point.
Just 4 months after arriving, Stefan Sorokin is embraced as spiritual leader by the Sons of Freedom, leaving John J. Verrigan's Orthodox Doukhobors perplexed and resentful. Shortly after, Sorokin slips out of Canada. He says he is searching for a country to give refuge to the Freedomites. With their money, Sorokin buys a farm in Uruguay, where author Sima Holt tracks him down.
I didn't believe it was religious persecution, but religion is always the stepping stone to power and to exploitation. And I did want to find Stefan Sorokin because I knew he was a fraud. I learned how he came to Canada, trained on how to manipulate the Sons of Freedom Doukhobors. And in fact, he did go to South America. He took $96,000 and a young woman. Women weren't his bag. He also took a young man. And I got into his desks. I found the receipts. He said, I'm like the Pope. The Pope collects money. Why shouldn't I? He had no intention of coming back other than to exploit them further.
To his credit, Sorokin does urge Freedomites to accept state education. Not only do the zealots ignore him, but in protest, they burn their own homes.
We were patrolling from Castlegar towards Shoreacres Bridge, and on the radio it came through that Cristova was burning. And as we carried on towards Shoreacres Bridge, you could see the red glare in the sky, and we knew something was really going up in flames. Sure enough, the majority of Cristova was gone. It was destroyed by fire.
To many Doukhobors, their stay here in Canada has always been a temporary one, until conditions became favorable for a return to Russia. This yearning now leaves them vulnerable to suggestion that this is the right moment for their migration back to Russia.
In 1953, I was told that as soon as we'd be arrested, when we burn our homes, leave our homes, we would go to Russia. The ship would be picking up the Doukhobors in Vancouver. And I agreed that it was time for us to move because we couldn't practice our faith here. And therefore, I agreed to burn my house. I waited and waited. All the houses around were burning, but nobody was telling me to burn the house.
Those who have burned their homes set up a tent village near Perry Siding on the Slocan River. Many of the campers, from children to aged babushkas, go about naked, intent on provocation. The RCMP is only too happy to oblige the Freedomites. A mass arrest perfectly suits the government's agenda.
I don't think there's any doubt at all that there was a plan on the part of the Social Credit Government of British Columbia to solve the Sons of Freedom problem, or at least part of it, by putting into place a policy which was that if the parents were not willing to send the children to school, then the state would step in and take the children and re-educate them.
On September 8, 1953, RCMP officers make a foray into the settlement. They warn against disobeying the law. Then, to test the Freedomites' mood, they arrest 2 camp leaders. Powerless, the Freedomites respond in one of the few ways they know how.
After we went in and did what we call a reconnaissance, those of us that went there had a good look at where everything was. And so we had a pretty good idea of how we were going to attack it the next day.
A column of RCMP officers, armed with lengths of rubber hose, march on the camp. The Sons of Freedom passively await their fate. Tension builds in the tent camp as RCMP officers march toward a showdown with the Freedomites.
And there were walking 4 of them, abreast, and all of them were carrying sticks, some of them, and some of them had fire hoses.
The 40 of us moved in all together, and we had a truck, and it was simply a matter of performing arrests. We backed the truck in, put down the tailgate, and we began arresting all of those people for failing to leave that area.
It was very scary to see that, especially when they're so much bigger than you. A uniform was always authority, and not always good, the way we saw it as children, I guess.
And it was just about that time when pandemonium may have broken loose, but there'd be a fair amount of crying and sobbing that they didn't like to be separated from their children, and I don't blame them, not one damn bit.
Some kids, they got underneath the tent, and then they ran to the woods, hide in the graveyard there. And then they were just swinging, and I seen one lady, one lady come running, and she ran towards her daughter. And he swung his billy stick right against her wrist. Then they start grabbing people like my mother, father, and they took them to the truck. And us kids, they took to the school bus. Then they took us one way, and the trucks went the other way. Where we were going, I don't know.
144 adults were loaded into the truck, carted off to a railway siding, and shipped to Vancouver. Sam Conkin, who had not burned his home or moved to the tent camp, did not want to miss the return to Russia.
With their arrest, I was disturbed because I felt bad that I didn't burn my house. These people were moving to Russia, and I wanted to go to Russia. So therefore, when someone gave me the news that the train will be stopping in South Slocan, I decided that I better go and check out with some of the people why I wasn't there. And when I got there, I was helped to go into one of the coaches with my friends. They pulled me through the window. And at this time, Moose Martin, Walter Martin, the police officer, noticed me there. And he says, Conkin, you have to get off the train because you haven't earned your ticket yet. You go back and you earn the ticket, and then we'll take you over.
Those who have earned their tickets appear before a specially convened court. Many are handed the maximum 3-year jail term. Needless to say, there is no Russian ship in the Vancouver harbor and no Freedomite migration to Russia. The real target in this elaborate operation is the children. 104 kids plus 13 mothers with infants.
We didn't know where we're going at all, but it was in the evening when they drove us to this big sanitarium, huge brown building. So, of course, we all got together in one group. None of us speak English.
Nestled between mountain ranges deep in the British Columbia interior, New Denver is the perfect holding ground for Freedomite children.
It was clearly planned to be a project in which children could be set against their parents, and that happened. In other cases, it embittered children even further, so that they became, if you like, a new generation of people who were ready not only to burn, but in some cases to bomb. It caused other children to renounce their Doukhobor heritage entirely, to walk away from the problem.
Well, our life changed in a big sense because when New Denver opened and they started to take kids away, we would always be on the lookout for police cars. You hear some of the Russian women shouting, and it would pass from house to house that the police are coming. And then all us children, wherever we were at home, we would run and hide.
Sometimes we would make the apprehension, other occasions it was a dry run, there was nobody there. they must have hid the youngster somewhere during the daylight hours.
Staff Sergeant Jack Randall remembers rising before dawn for a 4:30 a.m. briefing.
And at that time, our superiors would brief us on what this village looked like, and what we could expect, and what the age of the child was that we were looking for, who the parents were, what kind of reception that we might expect from them. And then from there, they gave specific members their tasks, and the members would just go about their tasks.
I was 7 years old when the police came and knocked on our door. They knocked and opened the door. They didn't bother waiting to hear come in or anything like that. It was just bang, the door opened.
The mother and father would be, particularly the mother, would go into a screaming tantrum because she knew why we were there. We were there to apprehend one of their children. And it was a very unpleasant scene.
And I was under the bed, hiding behind a sack of boots and rubbers. And the policeman, he took this billy club and he pushed the sack of rubbers, and I must have made a sound because he moved the sack away, and there I was. I just curled up into a ball and just lay there, sniveling and crying. He crawled in halfway under the bed and grabbed me by my hair and pulled me out, and that hurt. Anyways, pulled me out and he marched me out, and my mom was holding my jacket and she wanted to give me a hug. And she kept yelling my name, Fedichka, Fedichka, and he smacked her across the chest with the billy club. And then he just marched me over to the car, to the police car, threw me into the back seat, and that was it. Slammed the door. And
the raids become notorious. In January of 1955, 70 Mounties seal off Kristova and capture 40 children.
The reason we needed a lot of men on these raids, or it seems like an excessive amount of men, is that some of these villages had, maybe 20 or 30 people living in them. They were big people. A lot of the women probably weighed in excess of 250 pounds, and they were very difficult to move out of the way if they started to push and shove and try to prevent us from taking a child out. The children raids were very difficult for the members. A lot of them were family men themselves. If you saw the crying and the gnashing of teeth and everything else that went on during these raids, it was gut-wrenching.
I think I was looking out the window and I yelled to my mother there was cars coming. So she looked outside and there was police cars coming into our yard. I had a little trap door in my bedroom that I was going to go to when if something like that happened.
We couldn't find the little guy. And we saw loose carpet in one of the bedrooms. And here was a trap door to a crawl space. We lifted up the trap door and looked inside with a flashlight. And there we could see this little guy. And of course, we asked him to come out. And they were told that if the little guy didn't come out, we'd tear up the floor. And of course we wouldn't tear up the floor. But we did pull a few boards off one side of the house.
So here I looked out the hole I was in, and the policeman was right there, and he shone his flashlight in my face, and he yelled to the others. He says, I found him. As soon as he got me out of the cellar, the other policeman grabbed me. And while he was running with me, my head was hitting all the doorways.
Next stop for these kids is New Denver, billed by the media as nothing short of a resort.
Like a good summer camp, it provides plenty of free time, good supervision, safe facilities, time for the inevitable comic books.
My first memory of New Denver was I was standing in the yard because we weren't allowed inside. There was no room for us inside the dormitory. And everybody was milling outside, and I was standing crying outside. It was cold. There was police officers walking by and matrons, and I don't know how to describe this. When you don't understand the language, then you want to be home.
I'm sorry.
Nobody wanted to take the kids away from their parents, but they did it because they weren't getting education, and the law said they had to be in school. And if they can't have the same opportunity as the other kids in Canadian society, then what are we doing? What does the law mean?
They brought this one teacher, school teacher, big lady, and we call her Miss. And they made a little room with desk. Then she'll come to you with the pencil and a ruler, and you take. And of course, we're not going to take. We didn't take, and then we get whippings. Yes, she'll whip us with this ruler. And then she'll go to another child. But then there was little kids, I guess. Somebody just broke down and took the pencil, and then we all slowly took the pencils. And that's how, and shortly after, we started going to school.
Hugh Herbison had been part of the government's effort to persuade the Sons of Freedom to enroll their children in school. Interviewed in 1958, Herbison was offended by the government's heavy-handed techniques.
Well, I don't know that I want to make good Canadians out of them, the way the term is used, because personally I like them the way they are. I like good Doukhobors. Their children are just as decent and well brought up as mine are. And I don't know why we should be so eager to change the children.
Not knowing any English was not easy. I remember I had great difficulty trying to think of how I can ask if I may leave the room to use the bathroom. And I couldn't, I had no clue how to ask. So I didn't leave the room, but I used the bathroom in the classroom. I think I was about 8 then. Very, very degrading, very embarrassing.
How did you feel when you first came about the children being kept here?
My heart just felt funny, I'm telling you, and I thought to myself, I said to my oldest son, could this be Canada? I said, me see a thing like that in Canada. And I think we both felt bad about it. But it grew off after I came here and understood the situation more. I think you have to be with them to understand it.
Well, what did you find after you came to work here which seemed to you to be the justification for it?
Well, I thought it would help the children. And of course, I always kept uppermost in my mind that the parents were lawbreakers. They had to have some punishment.
How do you mean lawbreakers?
Well, they're not sending their children to school, and that's the law of Canada.
Our first visit with our parents, we stood there and we started singing and praying, and it was so emotional because that's all we did was cry, because it was just very emotional, because you saw your parents standing on the other side of the fence and you were on this side, and you knew you couldn't go to them and get that hug. Like, it really stays with you, that feeling, that hunger for your mom and dad to be hugged and to say, yeah, you're safe, or we're here for you, or all that emotion is still there.
Our family would come to visit once every 2 weeks on a Sunday. We'd just talk, and I know I'd look at Mom, she'd have tears in her eyes. I'm sorry. So I tried not to cry because I knew it was hard for Mom.
Well, we like to think they're happy, and every indication is such that they are happy. I think anyone that visits here can readily see that it's certainly no concentration camp. If they were to remain here until they were 17 or 18 years of age, then I'm sure that they would become good Canadian citizens.
In retrospect, some of these children are glad they had the opportunity to gain an education, but they still resent how it was forced upon them.
Just the way it was sort of done. And the fact that, visiting and stuff like that was held over your head, like you behave or you won't see your parents. That was not right.
BC Attorney General Robert Bonner insists that the government's goal is neither religious nor cultural assimilation. In this 1958 television interview, he makes his case.
I don't know of any group in the country who are free not to pay their taxes and not to pay improvement taxes on their homes, not under obligation to pay rent, not under obligation to register their births or their marriages or their deaths, and free from the obligation of educating their children.
I was a drunk for 27 years. I started craving alcohol when I was 13 years old, and I couldn't figure out why. I don't like authority of any kind. When I go to work, I hate people telling me what to do and how to go and do it. I still hate cops. Whenever I see a police officer, even 2 or 3 blocks away, I get a start, fear, anger. First thing that comes to mind when I look at a cop is asshole.
The standoff over schooling finally dissolves in 1959, when Sons of Freedom parents agree to send their children to regular government schools. Some of the New Denver children overcome their trauma, but for others, they feel their pain entitles them to commit violence of their own, and they become key players in the longest-running terrorist spree in Canada's history. In 1960, after living in Uruguay for 8 years, Stefan Sorokin returns to Canada for one of his periodic visits. Most Sons of Freedom continue to support him. Others see flaws.
Doukhobors try to paint a picture of a very pacifist culture, vegetarianism, no abuse of alcohol, that kind of a thing. And on the Sorokin was just the contrary. I saw him to be a violent-tempered man. As a child, I remember these vast, elaborate dinners that my family would put on for him. And the table would be packed with alcohol and packed with meat.
And I remember a particular incident at Creston where we walk into a restaurant at the bus depot, and much to my surprise, here's Mr. Ilasov, Mr. Mojelski, and Mr. Sorokin, the spiritual leader. And they sit there and they're halfway through one of the biggest steaks I ever saw. And I said, does the rest of your followers know the meal you're having? Well, they got so agitated, they just stood up. And I said, please sit down, enjoy it. I like steak too. I said, perhaps one day you'll buy me one.
Any encounters that I had with him, I always felt shamed. I guess I was searching for something. I was looking for some kind of spirituality, and whenever I had any kind of encounters with him, I always wondered, where's this guy, spiritual? Anything he talks about, it's all just bullshit. I never heard anything that came out of his mouth that was spiritual.
In 1960, the leader of the Orthodox Doukhobors, John J. Verrigan, urged on by the government, becomes the first Doukhobor to buy back a parcel of their confiscated land. Freedomite leaders, now organized into the Fraternal Council, view this as treason.
Early 1960, I was approached by one of the members or two of the members from Christo, from Fraternal Council, to make some bombs on the village's Orthodox Doukhobor community buildings. They have to be burned. For what reason, I wouldn't know. And I made some bombs, 36 bombs. I tested them, every one had worked perfectly. And I was scared that somebody will get burned in those burnings because it would be done at night. And I diffused the wirings from each bomb that they wouldn't ignite. I had never told Fraternal Council or any the members had placed the bombs that they wouldn't go off.
Not every Orthodox village is so lucky. In August 1961, Freedomites torched 26 homes in the village of Utashinia.
We didn't go there to destroy them. We went to save them. We thought, we had the feeling at that time, you know, that the bombings and the burnings would save the people from going into materialism.
In many cases, the Freedomites burn their own homes. Grace Burnett comforts her nieces as they watch their house burn.
My heart broke. And of course I had to come out of there and talk to my sister, like, how can this be happening? Why? Do you know how your kids feel? And she said to me, well, how do you feel? Because your house is burning as well, Mom and Dad's. So I ran. It was about a mile and a half, I guess. I ran all the way. I couldn't believe, but I could see all the smoke.
In February 1962, a group of 5 young men set out to bomb a post office near Castlegar. A New Denver survivor is one of them. Harry Kutnikoff has become a rebel with a cause.
So Harry was carrying the bomb, and it seemed like they were just turning the corner to get in there, and Harry must have leaned forward and squeezed the watch, and it made contact. And of course, the car was in shreds. He was blown to nearly bits. It was instant death.
Another explosion fells a hydro tower on Kootenai Lake and cuts power to the Bluebell mine. The mine begins to fill with water. Only auxiliary power saves the men underground.
So the public became so incensed, especially the miners, that the word went out that they're going to form a group and come down there, and just anything that looked like a Freedomite was going to get smacked but good, you see. At that point in time, we brought in about 40 extra members to prepare for that. And as it turned out, I, for one, and others in higher command, went to the mining community and said, don't do that.
Attorney General Robert Bonner and RCMP brass demand arrests. Fred Bodnarik, just 2 years out of basic training, is one of 3 new RCMP officers assigned to investigate the terrorism.
The first issue was to determine really who is the terrorist, and we were, may I say, ill-equipped to determine who was who, because there was the 2 sects there, the Orthodox and the Sons of Freedom. We had to do surreptitious photography and make comparisons and ask a lot of questions of the community as to who's who, because myself, coming in as a relative stranger, really didn't know one Doukhobor from another.
The 3 recruits pore over police records going back to the early 1930s. They stake out weddings, funerals, and prayer meetings, noting who associates with whom. They take hundreds of photos. Only the Communist Party has ever undergone this degree of scrutiny.
So we knew who the extremists were, if you want to call them that. The idea was to try and just keep tabs on them where they were moving around, and if you could place them at certain locations where there was arsons or bombings or things like that.
The Freedomites organize their own counterintelligence. Children watch the roads and signal the arrival of any strangers. They memorize the license plates of police ghost cars.
And one day I was on another search nearby, and this family leader came out and he challenged me and said, "You're not long for this world." And then he got so angry, he said, "We're going to shoot you with 303 rifle." I said to him, Andy was his first name, I said, "Andy, you people don't believe in violence." I said, "I'm surprised at you." So one day I was supposed to be on patrol and I drove a particular car, and the car received 5 bullet holes, 303 rifle. My friend, Ed Malinowski, just barely escaped being shot in my place.
In April 1961, the RCMP get the break they need. 2 bombs planted in the quiet village of Windell, several hours' drive from the nearest Freedomite settlement.
I'd say just about 40 years ago, the last time I was up here, and we was dropped off about a quarter mile on the highway, and then me and Leon Lijaboko, we walked by the railway tracks, and we came up to the elevator. We stood on the knees and we prayed that nobody would get hurt under our bomb. And we had placed the bomb on this right-hand corner. And I believe it was 18 sticks of dynamite. We said about halfway in the corner up there. There was a platform at that time in that corner. As soon as we set the bomb and we walked back on the tracks.
George Kanakin's prayers are answered. His bomb blows a hole in the grain elevator, but no one is hurt. The other bomb, planted inside the Anglican church, does not explode. It becomes Exhibit A in the conviction of a well-known Freedomite. After his arrest, he leads police to stashes of explosives.
In each case where we found dynamite, we effectively arrested the man that was responsible for the place, and my fellow officers took him into custody, and they were on to Nelson.
As one Freedomite informs on another, the RCMP work behind the scenes to guarantee the trials go according to plan. According to government records, they carefully investigated the backgrounds of over 90 potential jurors to help ensure that every defendant is convicted. With so many of their husbands and sons in Agassiz Mountain Prison, 500 kilometers away, Freedomite families feel the need to live closer to them. In the summer of 1962, they prepare for a mass exodus from the Kootenays. But before going, they feel compelled to purge themselves with fire.
It was like a war going on. I've seen nights where there was 20 fires burning. They would be standing out singing a hymn in the nude, kind of almost in shock by the look in their eyes, and their home or their residence was going up in flames, you know.
Well, when we were getting ready to burn our home in Cristova before leaving for the trek, I remember that we got together and we prayed as a family. I was young, I don't remember everything, but I do remember feeling that nervous feeling of, well, this is your home going up in flames.
Two weeks after the trekkers abandoned Cristova, government surveyors divide the communal lands into private plots, and the Freedomites lose their home base. But for the moment, the trek electrifies the Kootenays.
Even the air was some kind of tight, you know, you come out and you feel that the hundreds of people are walking. And we're all Doukhobors. And we're pushing the old people on some kind of wagons or something, you know. It's not hard, it's not easy. But the men were in jail and they went for them.
By the time they reach Castlegar, the trek has swelled to over 1,000 people.
I think this is one of the first times that I recognized and saw this kind of collective behavior that was thrilling and difficult to understand. So I watched them come in, and I watched them come into town, and I stood on a corner and listened to people mutter. The woman who was the secretary in the Bank of Montreal saying, they're crazy, they're crazy. I listened to an old Doukhobor man, Mr. Sukharukov, say to me, they are fanatics, they are fanatics.
For some non-Freedomite Doukhobors like Edna Saprikin, the trek is pure adventure.
And the minute I seen that mass of people and recognized many faces, I just had to be there. And I said, I'm going. And my mom just, she says, well, who are you going to go with? I don't know. Where are you going to stay? I don't know, but I'm going. And we went.
Barred from approaching Mountain Prison in Agassiz, the trekkers confound everyone by heading for Vancouver. This proves to be the worst possible move. For 60 years, the Freedomites have resisted modernism. Now encamped around Victory Square in downtown Vancouver, they are about to become immersed in it. Hundreds of Freedomites have spent the winter in Vancouver, demonstrating for the release of their husbands and sons. But back in Mountain Prison, the men are growing desperate.
There was a letter from Stefan Sorokin to go on a hunger strike till our death. So we went on a hunger strike. I think 32 or 33 days we was on a hunger strike. Then they start force feeding us.
They dipped these holes into the cold water, and it would be curled, and they'd push it into my nose, and it would curl in my chest, and it would come through my mouth, and they'd yank it, and the blood would start coming, and they'd push again. And I think my lungs were filled already with fluids.
Zaitsov's wife endures pain of her own in Vancouver. Their baby daughter contracts pneumonia while spending damp winter days in Victory Square. Doctors say the infant will not survive.
They say, she's dying, you better come. She's not going to make it till morning. But she did. And then a day went by, another knock on the door. Policeman came. And they said, we got your husband at the Shaughnessy, and we came to take you because he's dying too. When I walked into that hospital, he was laying, half a man, just a skeleton. And he was asking to die. He wanted to die.
I never felt the same. All my willpower, I guess, whatever, was taken away. I was just an empty shell. I did not have loving feelings anymore.
The largest hunger strike in Canadian history peters out after one young Freedomite starves himself to death. As for the trekkers in Vancouver, they board buses for Mountain Prison.
And when we got to the gates of Agassiz Mountain Prison, the police were waiting for us. So the buses stopped, and the bus driver said, this is the place where you get off. And we were singing, and he opened the doors, and the police officer
on the road said, "You don't get off. If you set foot on this ground, you're going to be arrested." So we just kept on singing, and we got off the bus and we stood around for a while, and then we just started walking towards the gates of the prison. Nobody got arrested.
They camp in a gravel pit beside the prison. The locals aren't sure how to react to this nomadic band of spirit wrestlers.
At first, some of them had pitchforks and shovels in their hands because they were scared that we were going to make some kind of trouble, I think. And I've heard some of them say that they thought that we had horns or big ears or whatever, that we looked different than other people. We just kept to ourselves for a good many years until we started meeting the locals.
Women in the camp develop an ingenious way to use their scarves to carry on conversations with their husbands behind the prison fence. Over the next 9 years, the camp becomes a regular hamlet, with large numbers of residents finding work in nearby communities. But Mountain Prison, meanwhile, has transferred away many of its Freedomite prisoners. By 1972, most of the residents have drifted away, and the last of the Freedomites abandoned the camp to return to the Kootenays.
And I remember leaving together with everybody and traveling. We traveled as far as Grand Forks, and the whole procession of vehicles stopped on the way down to Grand Forks on the hill beside J.J. Verrigan's. And I guess just saying, we're here without land, without homes. You're the leader. Help us out.
But J.J. Verrigan doesn't help them. In fact, he urges they be sent to mental asylums or jails. The Mounties are only too ready to oblige.
I remember the police coming and telling us to please move on. And of course we didn't leave. I remember we did demonstrate when the police would come. Several people would undress, they'd be arrested, taken away. And I remember being one of the groups that were taken away for disrobing.
They take refuge in an isolated corner of Cristova called the New Settlement. There, Stefan Sorokin, back from Uruguay once again, sets himself up as Lord.
My parents believed that Sorokin was a reincarnation of Christ, and that he was the chosen leader, Yesterbo, and that basically they instilled a lot of fear in us that we should always obey whatever he says.
Sorokin preys upon his people. Years of forced assimilation and fanaticism have created an unhealthy culture of secrecy in the Freedomite community. In this environment, absolute power can easily be abused. After Sorokin's death, several young men go public with horror stories about sexual abuse by their spiritual leader.
His wife or somebody called me up there that he wanted to see me, and I went up to his residence. He took me into this trailer. He told me to take my pants off, and he proceeded to give me a blowjob. And I mean, I was completely stunned, but my mind, because of my conditioning, you weren't allowed to even think a bad thought. Even though you felt something was wrong, your conditioning would be going against you even thinking a thought, because you think, oh, he could read your mind. What if he can, thinks that you're thinking this? I walked out of there kind of dazed and confused.
He asked me to get up on his massage table, and from that point on, my mind exploded. And before I knew it, my clothes were off, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't have the skills to tell him to stop. It still baffles me why none of those elderly men tried to stop any of this. Or maybe they did know because they had the same experience themselves, but having no skills to deal with it, they just lived with it all their life.
The Kootenai region becomes an inferno in the 1970s. Fire destroys 2 centers owned by J.J. Verrigan's community. Verrigan's mother's house and Stefan Sorokin's trailer are both damaged by arson. In 1979, this new reign of terror comes to a head in a spectacular criminal trial.
We, the Union of Spiritual Communities of Christ, have been, are, and will be members of Christ's church, confirmed by the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ himself and assembled by his apostles.
The alleged mastermind behind this violence, according to police, is none other than J.J. Verrigan Sr., recipient of the Order of Canada.
And the faith is professed.
Well, the Duke squad or the Doukhobor squad or the D squad of the RCMP thought that they were going to suddenly break the problem of the Doukhobors. They were going to bring it to an end, and they had this theory, and the theory was that John Verrigan had ordered the Freedomites, his mortal enemies, to do all these things.
In a bizarre trial, a key witness disappears. Another witness strips while giving testimony. A man dressed as Christ wanders into the court.
It had that atmosphere, somewhat of a circus atmosphere, and very funny evidence, you know, both because of language and just because of the crazy things, you know, the reverse logic. Well, didn't Mr. Verrigan tell you not to burn things? Yes, but, you know, when he told us not to burn things, his tie was twisted, and so we knew that he meant burn.
After Verrigan is acquitted, he demands that the government address Doukhobor issues. For once, the government listens. The Attorney General gets serious about a creative solution to the problem.
I bear with you.
He was looking for something that hadn't been tried before. Many of the Doukhobor issues had been dealt with through the courts, and what he was looking for was something that engaged the Doukhobors in some kind of discussion that would lead to a resolution of the issues that the courts themselves were not able to respond to.
A committee on intergroup relations brings Doukhobors and governments together in the hope of finding common ground. After an exhausting 5 years, the participants sign a landmark accord, rejecting violence as a means of protest. Today, unresolved pain from the New Denver years continues to weigh on the Doukhobor community.
Such a beautiful spot, but when you're a little kid sitting in a prison, all you see is that fence. There's no beauty anywhere.
Fred Konkin and Joe Schurstabitov remember New Denver only too well. They are among a group of former Freedomites who have filed a lawsuit against the British Columbia government.
We want public inquiry. We want an apology. And eventually we will want compensation.
For the wrongs done to us.
For the wrongs and for all the harm they did to us.
Lady would come by and smile and what we thought it is me.
Memories of a century of pain will never be forgotten. Still, Doukhobors today are perhaps more at peace and more united than at any time since the reign of Peter the Lordly Verrigan.
What is encouraging to me is that at least within the Doukhobor community, those elements that were at each other's throats before are now working together. Today, unlike in the past, where we were regarded by Canadian government authorities as potential fifth columnists or spies, we are now held in respect even because of our commitment to toil and peaceful life, because I hope that government is starting to recognize that at least for us as Doukhobors, the means do not justify the end.
After 100 years in Canada, many Doukhobors point with pride to their achievements, made by following the philosophy of toil and peaceful life. Although assimilation surely threatens Doukhobor culture, anthropologist Mark Mealing is confident that the Doukhobors will remain distinct.
When Doukhobors arrived in Canada just over a century ago, there were well-meaning journalists who said, these people are now going to come and become a part of Canada. And they have become a part of Canada, but they haven't stopped being Doukhobors, and they haven't stopped asking themselves, what is it to be a Doukhobor? I'm quite sure that long after I'm gone, there will still be Doukhobors around, and I think that some of them will still be asking what it is to be a Doukhobor.
I lost my mother young. If you have mothers, go visit them, hug them, and tell them you love them. That's my big regret. And another regret I do have for believing so strongly in the religion. Everybody should have religion, but not that strong, not that. Your children, your life should come first.
Here, you're linked.
J.J. Verrigan Jr. speaks at the anniversary of Peter the Lordly Verrigan's death.
You see this little pamятник? This is where a man very dear to your hearts, to the hearts of your moms and dads, and to the hearts of your babushki and dedushki, lost his life.
People that think that the bias against the Doukhobors has disappeared are engaged in wishful thinking. And so for me as a Doukhobor, to ensure that that bias never rises its head again, is to work for a better world, more just, humane, peaceful communities, whether here at home or globally.
Love your past and pray to God to give you strength to do the right thing when you're growing up. Thank you very, very much for coming out here. Thank all of you for coming out here.